Hi everyone! So last night Blizzard has released an update on Diablo 4 as a result of the data and feedback gathered from the open beta in March. And it looks really good. In my opinion, this is really a great step forward coming from the Diablo 4 team. And it seems like they're really paying attention to what people are saying, what people care about, and they're applying a lot of fixes rather quickly. There were some pretty game-breaking bugs and exploits and just like broken mechanics in the game that have been addressed. For example, the animation canceling, stutter stepping stuff that allowed you to increase your attack speed. There are several quality of life changes and just like, other tweaks to how dungeons are generated, for example. A few class changes, of course, so they talk a bit about the balancing and they mention a few examples, and that other things have been adjusted based on the feedback. So I'm gonna walk through the entire thing here and give my input on each of those points, and let's jump right into it. So the first points here are the dungeons. So they said that a lot of people were complaining about backtracking, and I do agree that this was definitely a bit of an issue. I felt like if you are a bit experienced with the layouts, it's not really such a problem anymore. But there were definitely cases where sometimes you can easily miss like a certain side room that has an objective, or the layouts were just not really that optimized in terms of minimizing the backtracking. And I actually went back and looked at all of the dungeons. They actually listed 9 dungeons here in particular out of the 22 that we were able to access in the beta that have received updates to their layouts. So this is like a 40% ratio or something, and I expect that this also extends to the other zones, even in those dungeons that we didn't get to play in the open beta, just to go again through all the dungeons and optimize the paths and these kind of things. So this is really cool. So obviously no one really wants to like just walk around backtracking, not really finding any monsters, these kind of things. You always want to be at least somewhere in the action. The game is already quite slow paced, so having even more downtime does not make much sense. Additionally, they also beefed up dungeons in general by giving a 60% chance to find an event inside a dungeon instead of only 10% chance. So I didn't know that this was actually a 10% chance. I just knew it was a rather low chance. So if you haven't run many dungeons, you might actually have missed this completely. But similar to like outdoor local events, you can actually find like little, alcoves or, just some random villager in the corner or something like that, and they spawn an event, or like a cursed chest, for example. I believe this also is included here. So there are these events, and they are actually quite nice to do. So if you just don't wanna go straight for the dungeon completion, for the renown, or for the Codex of Power aspect, then doing these events is actually quite valuable because they give usually quite good XP. There's usually a lot of monsters, and they also give you a chest at the end. They give you balls that you can use for gambling with the Purveyor of Curiosities. So this is a pretty good way of gearing up if you want to spend the extra time. And I think this is a really nice number here. 60% chance is good enough. It's like more than half of the runs. You're going to find something and you can decide to do it or leave it. And let's see how that will play out. But in general, this is a really nice change just to like spice up dungeons a bit more, not have them become like too repetitive or too unrewarding. There are other various dungeon improvements here. So for example, all these objectives that you have to pick up or put on a pedestal and these kind of things, all the channeling times have been reduced. You can see this here. Depositing animals literally has no time anymore. The same for pedestal interaction. So you usually have to like pick something up and then you have to wait and then you have to put it down again and have to wait. Now you also get like a 25% movement speed buff while you're carrying one of those objectives. So it actually feels a bit more like a reward and not like, you have to find it and then you have to drag it back to the pedestal. So it will actually feel quite good, I guess, because of that buff. And you also get some other like, small things, for example, rescue objectives now give you a health potion. I mean, that's kind of like not really a buff even, but it's like a neat little thing, I guess. So that's kind of funny. Then time to rescue has been reduced. So this will obviously also allow certain strategies where you don't actually kill like every single monster nearby. So maybe you can actually just like, try to CC them and then, run and click on the objective and keep moving if you don't want to like just fight everything one by one. But I don't think this is really such a big problem, so that's probably fine. Also some other little things like you gain resource and reset your cooldowns now when you get animals. Yeah, just overall makes it feel like more smooth, more dynamic, faster, and I think that this is actually a real good step in the right direction. Just still, you still have those objectives, but they don't really feel like, you know, such a downside anymore. You actually get something out of them. So I think this will actually turn around this entire like feeling that a lot of people had with those objectives kind of being more of an annoyance than anything. They actually added this developers note here. I'm not sure if this was there last time I read it, but basically saying exactly the same thing. And also they say that this is obviously not the last adjustment, so there might be further tweaks. You know, there's a lot of different objectives in the dungeons that you can find, and maybe they're gonna add more different objectives in the long run in new dungeons, or maybe they're gonna rework some of them down the line. So I expect that in general they will give you like these kind of little tidbits for completing those objectives, in addition to actually being able to progress through the dungeon, which is really cool. Here's some class stuff, but I want to finish with the general stuff first, and then we go into the classes. They did a few UI and other adjustments here. One important thing here is the mouse wheel. So now you can actually bind everything to a mouse wheel, including a force move. That was actually already the case, but it was just bugged. So I expected this change anyway. But a lot of people, including me, are used to moving your character with the mouse wheel with force moves. So it's really cool that this works now. Some other various fixes. They moved the chat to the left side of the screen. So the technology is there. That's pretty cool. So it's basically like in any other game now. They also added some other quality of life stuff here, like the character stats are displayed immediately when you press on materials and stats instead of the materials, which is kind of funny, I gotta say. So they basically just like flipped it, because previously this was the complaint that you had to click on this button and then you have to click on the stats button, and it just felt like too tedious. And now it's just like, okay, the stats open first and then the materials open second, which I guess is fine. I'm just kind of surprised that they didn't do two buttons, but okay. And also, this was also another common complaint that I heard from people that liked to map their force move to left mouse buttons so that you only move while left clicking and not to click on monsters. But they couldn't also interact with objects, and they had to use a separate button for that. And now you can actually do both at the same time, so that you can force move and click on objectives at the same time with left click. That's pretty cool for people that like to do that. For the encounter fixes, you might have seen these clips that people are able to bug out certain bosses by spawning minions right inside of them, basically. And that would bug out the AI, so they didn't do anything anymore. So that was fixed, that's nice. They also buffed the Butcher, so in case you thought that he was too easy, then you have something to look forward to. And they also just like changed some encounters for melee difficulty. So yeah, melee in general has a downside that you generally take more damage, and some of those fights definitely were quite punishing. So it's kind of cool that they are paying attention to that to try to balance it a little bit. They also juiced up the sellers a little bit, so this was actually a suggestion that I also made. I felt like sellers were just like really useless. Most of the time you just walk in, there's like basically nothing in there, and you go out again, and you can even reset them like over and over. And yeah, the main problem here was that either they are really valuable and you just farm them all the time, or they are worthless and you never go in there. And they actually did two changes here. So first of all, they buffed them, which is what I suggested as well. And second, they also removed the reset dungeon button, but I'm going to go into that in a second. So this allowed them to do this change here, basically to make sellers just a lot better. And there's always a chest now, there's more events, and you know, a bunch of other things, which is pretty cool actually. Yeah, and speaking of this reset dungeon button, so they actually have this developers note here, and in general, I also thought that this was more likely going to happen than not. So we have seen this in the beta that people were just like spam farming the same dungeons over and over, and obviously this is not really a good experience. It's just efficient. I mean, some people might enjoy that a lot, obviously because it is efficient, or maybe they just really like, you know, doing this and nothing else. But the truth is that Diablo 4 is not really designed for that, in my opinion. And I also think that it has become obvious with this change here, and with this huge open world with like, you know, 100+ dungeons and all this kind of stuff. They kind of want you to go around and do different things. There's a renown system that they want you to complete to get those extra skill points and paragon points. So you actually have to go around to actually get all this stuff. And this is, you know, just the way to do it anyway. I think this spamming a dungeon strategy that people were doing in the beta was mostly a beta thing, and we're not going to see this very much in the final launch. even without this change. In the beta, you were simply stuck at level 25 and there was nothing left to do. So this is how that whole strategy emerged. But yeah, realistically, I don't really think this would translate into the actual launch, because you have to do campaign. You're probably going to be like close to level 50 from that anyway. Then you do all the renown. You're probably going to be like, level 70, level 80 or whatever, or even higher. And then comes the time to like, start doing, Hell Tides, Nightmare Dungeons, PvP, whatever, to grind to 100 and beyond, basically gearing up your character. So this kind of like spam running dungeons is kind of, maybe something for all characters at the very most. But either way, they added this developer's note here explaining a few of these things here, and you can see that, it doesn't really seem intended that people spam the same dungeon over and over, so they disabled the button for now. There will still be ways to reset a dungeon, for example, by partying up, or probably just by, going out and doing another dungeon. At some point, it will reset. So they haven't really given us the details here. But also, again, this is mostly like a low-level thing, because later on you're going to do Nightmare Dungeons, and Nightmare Dungeons are run with those sigils, and those sigils will automatically include a reset anyway for those dungeons. So you can still run them over and over if you want to. And there are some of those other changes here, like they added a grace period. So this is quite common in these games. You load in and you're invincible until you move. This wasn't the case before, so that's great. And also, this is actually a funny fix here. There were certain areas in the world where just no monsters were spawning, or way less monsters. Even some of those unique monsters that drop these specific items. You might have remembered this level 35 elite. There's a similar one like that somewhere in the top right of the map that did not spawn until you completed a certain campaign step. So also kind of funny to see that. Yeah, and let's get into the class changes. So obviously they have done some tweaks here, and I don't expect this to be the full list of all the changes they made, especially because a lot of that is actually hidden in this one point and we don't have the details. So it didn't give us like the full, patch notes of every single item that they're changing. But they say that a lot of the legendary powers have been updated, and this could really mean anything for anyone, basically. Because a lot of builds were actually like designed around very powerful legendary effects, especially once you started stacking up certain like skill-specific powers, which I found to be generally too strong compared to the non-skill specific, the generic powers. I think that there has probably been like generally, some adjustments down to most of them, especially some of the barb ones were extremely powerful, whirlwind 80% crit chance, upheaval 230% extra multiplicative damage, this stuff is like crazy. And there are other examples like that as well that were just like completely busted. For example, Twisting Blades, Hydra, lots of Druid things, like the Shockwave for the Pulverize. There's many examples I could name here, just at the top of my head, that were just like way too crazy compared to some of the more like, regular powers that you can find. So I think it's fine that these skill-specific powers are, impactful, but I don't think they should be like that mandatory to even make a skill work in the first place. And I'd rather see more power just like baked into the skill itself and using those legendaries to maybe alter the skill with how it works. For example, the Flurry. You might have seen the Flurry power that makes Flurry like a 360-degree angle on the rogue. So something like that is really cool because it allows you to either have like a very strong offensive legendary aspect in that slot, or you have this extra utility for more AoE. Same with Penetrating Shot, for example, where you have those side arrows. It doesn't actually buff the damage of the skill, and instead it gives you more AoE coverage. So you have like the option to choose between two different effects, so to say. But other cases just made it too mandatory to have this power to make the skill even good. So I think that this is probably what we're seeing here. What is also pretty nice though is that they actually basically buffed player power quite a lot. So they made it so that you can CC elite monsters twice as long. Previously, elite monsters were able to be crowd controlled for 2.5 seconds and became unstoppable for 5 seconds afterwards. And 2.5 seconds was really a short time because, most of the time you actually have to actively apply a crowd control, and then you already spend like, some time, doing another animation or another setup or something like that to actually start dealing damage. And a lot of damage mechanics were actually based around crowd controlling enemies. So there are not just those examples like, for example, Frost Nova plus Ice Shards on the Sorcerer, But just in general, like you have damage to crowd controlled enemies, damage to chilled enemies, these kind of effects that give you extra damage for all of your attacks. And usually this doesn't apply to those elite monsters very well, or for example, it doesn't apply to bosses because they become unstoppable or immune pretty easily. So now you can actually CC them for 5 seconds in a row, and that is a pretty significant buff. So that even when you don't have this insane burst damage to nuke them down, you have more of a reason to actually include crowd controls now. And they also did some tweaks here to make sure that every class has something to break crowd controls. So there are some skills, for example, Shadow Step on the Rogue, or I believe Charge on the Barb and Trample on the Druid, and these kind of things that make you unstoppable when you use them. So I guess there's probably like something that they added for Necromancers, I imagine, because Necromancers didn't have anything besides Blood Mist that makes you straight up immune to everything. So maybe they added something there. Or maybe something on the Druid or so, or on the Sorc. Sorc had Teleport, and I think that was pretty much it. And in addition, I gotta say that it seems really cool that they are working on class balance continuously, and this is obviously not gonna be like the last step here. So I guess even leading up to launch, going beyond these notes here, there's probably gonna be more tweaks, more adjustments to various skills and passes and these kind of things. So again, something to keep in mind here. But anyway, let's go into the class-specific changes. We have the Barbarian first. They added a flat 10% damage reduction for the Barbs and tuned down some other things that you can find on the passive tree. So I think this will be a great help to just make Barbs feel a bit more smooth in the early game. This was a common complaint. And yeah, this is definitely nice, so that you just like feel a bit tankier on a full melee class, and that makes a lot of sense. They buffed Morrowind, so that seems quite powerful potentially. Depending on what exactly they did there. But yeah, Whirlwind doing more damage, but costing more fury. So it's becoming like pretty evident here that they want you to have like a pretty active play style, not just like, spin to win, hold down one button forever until everything is dead, but they do compensate you for it. So that is pretty cool. Personally, I like this kind of change where, yeah, builds don't really become like too mindless basically. But maybe there's still going to be ways to get enough fury to just perma Whirlwind anyway, and it's effectively just a buff in the late game. And then they also like slightly buffed Double Swing. Yeah, I didn't really play with Double Swing, I gotta say. I felt like it was not really worth using at all. And this also doesn't really help with that too much. But I guess it might become more evident later down the line. Then you have Druids. So they buffed the companion skills that deal heavily increased damage, which I felt was not really that necessary. But I guess it does make companion skills more worthwhile. Probably even as like a kind of like overall solid choice to just include in most builds now, because they are free, so they don't cost any resources. You can spam all the core skills as much as you can, and then you have this for some extra burst. So this is usually how I play the Druid anyway, but I mostly use those companion skills as like a utility effect and not so much for the damage. So maybe they will actually be worthwhile for that now as well, like the Creeper, maybe doing some really heavy poison, the Wolves that are actually kind of low utility, so they were mostly there for damage. And I barely used them, so they could definitely need a buff. And you also had the Ravens that didn't really seem to do much, but they were able to apply Vulnerable, for example, which was quite helpful as well. So yeah, quite nice. And there is already like this Werewolf companion build for Druids that is enabled by certain legendary effects that buff the companions. And this could potentially be pretty busted now, I guess. Then they also buffed all the ultimate skills, so that was really nice, because I felt like the Druid ultimate skills were actually all pretty cool. But again, kind of suffered from the typical ultimate problem, I guess, and way too long cooldowns. And it seems like there will be ways to actually shorten them anyway, but they also like straight up reduce the cooldown. So for something like Lacerate, for example, the Wolf ultimate, it makes you like attack 10 times. That felt super weak. So did the, I don't know what it calls, the Cataclysm or something, like the Storm that you summon for like the Storm Druid. I didn't really like that skill at all, because it was kind of cool to just summon a bunch of random tornadoes and lightning strikes, but it was not impactful enough for like a 70-second cooldown. So if all the stuff is like tuned down by like, let's say 20-25% or so, that could make these ultimate skills definitely way more worthwhile. Then they also made some improvements here to Maul and Pulverize, whatever that means. I guess this is probably referring to this 10-second timer with the overpower. So maybe that was tuned down, so I can use it more often. Or maybe you have like a bigger range of health, because it requires you to stay above 80% of your life to actually get this effect. So maybe you can just always do overpower every 10 seconds now or something like that. Who knows? And I'm not sure what they would change about Maul. Maybe just make it like, you know, smoother or faster animation or something. And also, quite underrated buff, I guess. And using a non-shapeshifting skill will transform the Druid back to the human form. This allows more shapeshifting synergies. So, for example, there is one passive that gives you spirit back when you shapeshift into human form. So this will happen every time you use like Earthen Bulwark or Hurricane or one of the ultimates or these kind of things, even while playing a Wolf Druid or Bear Druid or something like that. So it will be a bit easier to actually get your resources up, and this will help Druid in general in the early game, which is really nice. So that's definitely really cool to see. Then we have the Necros. They actually made some of the Necros, I guess they nerfed them. So they made it a lot more active at least. So you have to like use your corpses much more often now. Your summoned minions will die more often. This could be either from the bone mages just killing themselves faster, but also maybe they're just more squishy, or maybe they tune down the passive that allowed them to like only take a certain HP of in one hit basically. So there are some tweaks here that they could have done. What this means is, yeah, you have to try a bit harder, I guess, as a summon necro, which was, to be fair, like really, really powerful in the early game at least, but also nothing that I expected to be good in the late game. So I'm not really sure why they do this, but it might be compensated by this note here. So it says that many bonuses have had their stats increased. So I imagine that probably the choice of which minions you're running is probably way more important now, so that, you know, there's a bigger differentiation, and, you know, some of those effects give you like a lot more resource now. Some of those effects give you like, you know, stronger offensive choices for your skellies, some more stronger defensive choices and these kind of things, so that actually making the right choice for your build becomes a bit more worthwhile. And I imagine they also beefed up the sacrifice bonuses a little bit here while they're added, because they all felt kind of weak in general as well. And they have nerfed Corpse Explosion. That was expected, because yeah, there was basically no reason not to run Corpse Explosion. It was just like free real estate. And I don't really want to have like every single Necromancer build based around Corpse Explosion and just like with a tiny bit of flavor of how you kill the boss. So that was kind of cool. And they also did some visual adjustments here. Then we have the Rogue. So they buffed subterfuge skills. So there's like Dark Shroud, the Smoke Grenade, the Concealment, and the Poison Trap, which I felt didn't really need a buff generally, but there are definitely some candidates here, for example the Poison Trap or even the Concealment, where I felt like it was not really worth that much to actually go for the upgrade or even use the skill in general. But it's definitely cool that they are buffing this here a little bit. They had multiple passive skills that got increased. That actually surprised me. I felt like on Rogue there are basically no useless passives. The only passive skill that I really did not like at all on Rogue is Impetus, and that gives you like a damage bonus for moving a certain distance. And the problem with that is just the distance is way too large. You have to move like the entire screen to get that buff, and then your next attack deals a bit more damage. So it just doesn't really feel worthwhile to use that in most cases. But outside of that, I felt like a lot of the offensive passives were really strong already on the Rogue. The defensive passives were relatively solid. So let's see what happens here, but I guess it's just like an overall slight buff, and also to compensate for this here, because a lot of builds actually were based around imbuement skills, in particular Shadow Imbuement, and they increased the cooldowns on that. So that could mean anything. I guess it's not really such a heavy increase, but the base cooldown of imbuement skills is 9 seconds. So you're able to use them very frequently, especially on Twisting Blades build that had cooldown resets. But even without that, and I would expect this to be something like 11, 12 seconds now maybe, or something like that. So just like, you know, a 20, 30% cooldown increase. So it will probably be noticeable, and you're not gonna like spam them as much. And I think this is generally fine. I think that imbuements being a bit more of a situational tool instead of something that you do pretty much every single time you attack, especially on combo point based builds, is probably a good thing, so that there's a bit more like, you know, tactical like thought involved in using them. And with a buff here, I guess that the rogues is going to be just fine. And finally, we have the Sorcerer. So they buffed Charged Bolts, which I felt was really needed. They also nerfed Chain Lightning, which I felt was also needed. So, of course, we have to see like how much was actually changed here. But yeah, Charged Bolts was really a joke. So that is definitely good to see. especially considering that you have to do this shotgunning to do good single target damage and these kind of things. You have to be like pretty up close to enemies to really get a good effect of this. So that is nice. They buffed the Incinerate's enchantment. So this is actually something I made a video about. We might have seen this. I guess there were some other tweaks here, like, that we don't see in the patch notes, like it not spawning off screen and these kind of things. So maybe it's just like permanently up now next to you, breathing some fire. So it might be nice. And finally, they also buffed firewalls and the meteors. So I think that both these skills already had a lot of potential to be like super powerful endgame builds. So yeah, firewall enchantment makes it spawn automatically below enemies under certain circumstances, I believe on lucky hit, or just from like burning damage basically. And similar with the meteor, meteor had like a really low lucky hit chance to proc 3 meteors, and they buffed that. So I already felt that meteor has definitely really high potential to be like some insane endgame build, and now even more so, because there's a pretty strong synergy for it. And I'm quite excited to try a Meteor Sorc at some point. And that's also it for these patch notes here. I have them linked in the description if you want to go read through them again. Also, there is this developer update on the 20th of April featuring Riker actually. I'm going to be watching that live on stream. I'm going to be reacting to it and discussing it. And also obviously I'm going to have an upload for you afterwards here, just to like go through it again and see what they said, if there's any new juicy info. And obviously I'm going to be pumping out more Diablo 4 content leading up to launch and beyond. In general though, I gotta say it's really refreshing to see this post that Blizzard has made here about basically their takeaways from the beta. I think this is a really good sign for the game, with the developers actually being aware of the feedback and implementing fixes, fixing the bugs, fixing the exploits, tweaking the balance. Obviously this is a continuous process, so I don't really expect them to get like everything perfectly right from the start, but they are listening. And this really makes me very optimistic for the game's future. It really seems like they are working on the game, and this is already something I noticed basically from last time I played back in December, for example, with the press beta. There were a lot of changes that were done to the open beta in March, 3 months later, where I noticed there were many adjustments to skills, to passives. Some things were completely changed. Some dungeons were changed. The bosses were super beefed up because everyone found them super boring last time. And in the open beta, I already saw so many fixes. It was actually relatively impressive, but obviously no one else was really able to get a grasp of that because they hadn't played before. And now we're also seeing those fixes that come out of the open beta leading up to launch. There's probably going to be more stuff that's changed that is not here in this list anyway. As I mentioned, for example, with the legendary powers, there's probably like some continuous process where they're tweaking stuff, making adjustments anyway. And I imagine this is just going to be a continuous cycle now with regular patches, maybe even between season launches, where they might like tweak certain things that if they're like really broken or something like that. If you compare this to Diablo 2 and Diablo 3, usually we have very infrequent patches these days, and also not really too much transparency on what is going to happen and why. So I really appreciate Blizzard actually doing this. In any case, that's it for this video here. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts on it. Let me know what you think as well. If there's anything that they completely missed. There are definitely some examples that we already discussed, like the hardcore changes. I made my video about that as well, and there's definitely some stuff to be done. But again, there are still some weeks to go. There's still time for Blizzard to do things, and it seems like they are moving forward relatively fast with a lot of good stuff. So I'm excited, just a few more weeks and then we get to blast. Hope you like this one, and see you guys next time.